You know, guys, we were at a historical moment in world history for two reasons. We're coming off of our COVID period, coming down the slope, but also we're looking at the first time that the state of New Jersey will be officially commemorating Juneteenth on Saturday, June 19th, 2021. So I think, it's time for us to begin to perhaps put the wheels in motion here at Seton Hall to think about some of the programming that we could possibly put in place to make sure that this is not just another holiday weekend with barbecue and baked beans, but that the historical significance really comes across. So Larry, I guess from that historical point of view, what types of things should be emphasized that normally would not, come forward to the public?
I think one of the things that needs to be emphasized is that emancipation was controversial. When Lincoln issued it, not only was he condemned in the Confederacy, Northern Democrats, including those in New Jersey and New York and the Midwest, condemned him for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. It also set the stage for recruitment of black troops into the Union Army. So it did two things, and both of which were quite controversial. When the Civil War ends, 10% of the Union Army is black. 180,000 men out of 1,800,000 that wore the Union blue were African Americans. And now military historians are crediting them with adding to the factors that contributed to a Union victory. So that's so important that what we see here is not just emancipation from the pen of the president, but black people voting with their feet. And most of those black people that were in the Union Army were Southern blacks who defected, I say defected, that's a Confederate word, from the plantations to join up in the Union Army. And so that's so important to understand that. And also to understand that not everyone in the North was happy with that. The New Jersey legislature initially voted not to ratify the 13th Amendment. So it was quite controversial. And then when blacks finally hear about that in the South, it's so important to understand their expectations. What did freedom mean to them?
Certainly, yep.
It meant a lot of things, that their marriages would be legalized, that they couldn't be separated, families couldn't be separated. Many hoped for land, and they hoped for the vote and citizenship. And the issue of land became the first actual talk of reparations. They didn't use the term, but that's what they, at that time, many thought this is what those who have been in bondage for 250 years are entitled to some sort of payment for that.
Indeed.
And so I think focusing on black expectations, and yet at the same time, what we see are those in the South with their collaborators in the North wanted to deny blacks citizenship.
Indeed.
And the origins of the Klan come out of this specifically in 1866, Pulaski, Tennessee, to deny blacks the right of political participation. And this is where we see the first white supremacist paramilitary groups formed to do that.
That's right. The roots of all of that just come out of that one episode. You think freedom is free, but freedom has its cost. So then I guess you are then in telling us that, how does racial terror then begin to play a part in that freedom experience?
Racial terror was very, very important as an obstacle to black voting and participation. To give you an example, once the Reconstruction Acts and the 15th Amendment is passed, giving the people the right to vote, couldn't be denied because of previous condition of servitude, we see blacks elected to state legislatures, and the vast majority of them are literate. Some have been educated in the North, others had received education. They're voting, they're holding office, and we see this violence. 34 black elected and appointed political officials were murdered or were assassinated during Reconstruction.
Wow.
And hundreds of others were attacked. The number of blacks that may have been killed in political violence in the South are now estimated somewhere around 3,000. We know 500, close to 500 were murdered in Texas alone in this kind of violence. So when we look at the Klan, and it's still around today, understand what this organization participated in. This is the first voter suppression.
That's right.
Yeah, they weren't cutting around the margins. It wasn't literacy tests. That'll come in later. This is just outright terror. And it's what Southern blacks have lived with for years. I'm so glad to hear about Tulsa, and that people are coming to realize what happened in Tulsa in 1921. But there's a whole slew of attacks on blacks in towns. We could talk about the Atlanta race riot at the turn of the century, to Springfield, Illinois, 1908, Wilmington, 1898, East St. Louis in 1917, Chicago in 1919. We could go on, yeah.
By all means.
Yeah.
And that's not all of the history that ever gets included in the majority of the textbooks that are getting into the secondary schools level.
And
Yeah,
that's
right.
so important that you bring that up, because this is not new information for historians. Historians for the last 75 years have actually been documenting this kind of violence and obstacles in their history journals, in university presses, but basically only read by other historians. So now it's getting out to the general population, and some are now, they find it unimaginable.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But it is there. And so how do we educate people and realize that American history is nuanced?
That's right.
And there are positive aspects and there are negative aspects. And that's true to any nation's history. But if we want history to teach us lessons, then it has to be based on truth and
Absolutely.
facts.
Absolutely. Kelly, how does, from the Africana Studies perspective, what challenges does this present in terms of looking at America in the 21st century?
It's interesting because, we go back, even though Africana Studies starts in 1968 in terms
Right.
of in colleges and universities, we go back to Du Bois.
Okay.
And it's interesting that Dr. Greene talked about Du Bois, because when he wrote in Black Reconstruction,
Indeed.
he talked about the largest slave rebellion being enslaved Africans joining the Union Army, and that being the largest slave rebellion. Not only that, but he also said that the slave was set free, had a brief walk in the sun, and was turned back to slavery. So we have to understand what happens after, when progress is made. We always have to understand the particular challenges, the counter that comes right after that. And we've seen that. We saw it with Reconstruction. We saw it during the Civil Rights Movement. We saw it with the New Deal in many ways. And now we're seeing it right now with what's happening. So you get Barack Obama was elected. That was a victory for some people. Joe Biden was elected. That was a victory for some people.
Right.
But then you get this reverberation about states' rights coming up again, right? Same thing that happened during Reconstruction. So the reason that we have Juneteenth, the reason that there is a Juneteenth, was because people in Texas were saying, well, our state right, we have the right to have slaves.
Yeah.
And no Union soldier, no president can tell us otherwise, right?
Indeed.
So this whole states' rights argument has always been this thing. We have a right to run our state, control our state the way we want to. And so that states' rights argument has come right back up. And it's something that we always have to be mindful. That's why history is so important, because we have to go back and see what's happened in the past so we cannot repeat the same thing. And it might be in different variations like it is. States' rights today is, of course, a little different than it was back in the 19th century, but it's still the same underlying piece.
That's so important, Dr. Harris. It's so important. And I wonder, are we going to continue to make progress, or are we going to regress? We can celebrate emancipation in Juneteenth in 1865. Slavery is over and freedom has been obtained, and we have some black people sitting in the state legislatures. There are 2 black U.S. senators during Reconstruction. 35 years later, in 1900, there are no longer any blacks in the U.S. Congress. No black senators. Black voting has been virtually squashed by 1900. And where are the majority of blacks? They're sharecroppers and tenant farmers on southern plantations producing cotton and tobacco and rice, what they had produced for 250 years in the South. So this idea of regression and slippage is a very real possibility. And some people look back at the South and the good old days, the nostalgia of Gone with the Wind. That's what, for some people, that is an America that they like.
Indeed.
I think that's the key point too. When you think about talk about the 1619 Project and how states are outlawing teaching it in the classroom. Talk about critical race theory, how people are trying to outlaw teaching it in the classroom. They tried to whitewash that history too of Reconstruction, right? And we talk about Tulsa, they try to whitewash that as well, right? But we see that right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, this the importance of propaganda in terms of trying to redefine what Reconstruction was and what the war was about, right? That's where you get the famous Birth of the Nation film, right? Which tried to show that the Confederates were misunderstood and they were just trying to protect white lives from black savages, right?
Absolutely.
Same thing. So even now, when people talk about George Floyd and the BLM and the protests and things, there's another counter narrative coming that's showing, well, those people are bad people. George Floyd was a bad person. They were dangerous. They're threats to America and democracy and all these kind of things. So we have to be very careful about that and really have to really be diligent in fighting against it.
I think it's going to be a challenge for us to help bring all aspects of the university into understanding the role that every institution, that is from the family, economics, the churches, the political institution, and the economic institution, have played in understanding that denial of freedom to the great enslaved population. So I think this is going to be a challenge for us, but I think working together as a team, we'll be able to put on some first-class programming, and so that we'll make our mark on history also.
And that's a great challenge for America as a democracy. In authoritarian regimes, they always create a fantasy history. The Third Reich did, Stalin did. All authoritarian regimes only want positive things that they have done, and they want to hide all the negative developments. The question here is, are we going to have history as it really was? Or are we going to create a mythology, a mythological nostalgia that never really existed? And we're at that crossroads. We're at a critical crossroads, I think, guys. I think we're at a critical crossroads.
By all means. I think one of the most influential books I've ever given to students beyond the narratives of the African-American historians and others who specialize in that period is Lowen's book called Lies My Teacher Taught Me. It's just revelatory to have a Caucasian scholar, in a sense, writing about the typical American history curriculum as it's taught and the things that really have gotten covered up, ranging from Christopher Columbus to the Confederacy and so forth. Well, I hope you do well.
I think that that's very critical what you just said. Okay. Before, when we were talking, Dr. Greene talked about the research of Eric Foner and David Blight. There are a lot more allies who are writing about this history. So we're not in the struggle alone. So I think that's very important to remember.
Good.
Yeah. That's true.
Let's get ready to build some allies in 2021.
Yeah.
Should be a good challenge for all of us.